They chewed candle fat, sipped beer brewed from rainwater, and still had the audacity to hurl freshly baked loaves over the walls just to prove they could. Yes, in a world where famine lurked outside the gate, medieval towns sometimes flaunted buffet-style bravado. How did they stock a pantry big enough to thumb their noses at an army? Wait, better question, how did they keep everyone from eating the pantry guards first? Stick around, because the answers are equal parts ingenious, disgusting, and weirdly inspiring. The trick, it turns out, started long before the trumpet of siege ever echoed across the valley. Medieval burghers treated grain like modern people treat cloud storage. Overpay now so you don't lose everything later. Community coffers bought entire harvests, packed wheat and barley into massive stone granaries, then sealed the doors behind religious wax seals, helpful for keeping out both rats and overly enthusiastic tax collectors. Grain was the calorie king. A single cellar the size of a village church could hold enough to feed 5,000 mouths for a year. And because fungi love damp gossip, not dry kernels, grain kept astonishingly well as long as no one got creative with ventilation. Of course, people still tried. Some bright spark always does. So town councils posted watchmen whose whole job was stare nervously at sacks of wheat. Nothing fastens civic unity like collectively guarding lunch. But grain alone doesn't prevent mutiny. People crave texture, salt, and the comforting illusion of variety. Enter the medieval saltworks, marshy flats boiled down to white crystals that could turn a butchered ox into medieval jerky before you could say cholera. Salted beef, ham, and fish hung from rafters like grotesque chandeliers. Edible decor with a 2-year shelf life. For garrison morale, sausages were threaded into chains so long they doubled as garlands during feast days. Yes, they ate the decorations when things got bleak. Wouldn't you? That still left greenery, because scurvy makes for poor archery. Surprisingly, siege chefs looked up, literally. Many walled towns extended rafters into rooftop planters, shallow boxes of soil where onions, leeks, and medicinal herbs swayed like tiny flags of defiance. Monks recorded rooftop cabbages in Lubeck, rooftop lettuce in York, rooftop everything in Lubeck again when the first batch got accidentally harvested early. Gardens thrived because smoke from fireplaces below warmed the soil, giving townsfolk an unintentional greenhouse. When walls shook with catapult stones, gardeners simply ducked, whispered a prayer, and kept weeding. After all, you can't eat broken masonry. For protein that didn't require a blacksmith to sharpen, towns imported livestock, alive because carcasses rot, but chickens lay eggs under artillery fire. Piglets rooted through lane garbage, goats browsed ivy climbing the inner walls, and rabbits bred so enthusiastically they bordered on treason. Records from besieged Toulouse mention the mayor's emergency warrant, essentially legalized rabbit hoarding. Fortunes were swapped for a pregnant doe. You could trade one for a suit of chainmail or the release of a cousin captured during an ill-advised sally. Because of course, family loyalty had an exchange rate. Water posed another existential riddle. Wells inside walls were obvious until besiegers poisoned aquifers downstream, so towns diversified. Rainwater cisterns lined with pitch-collected winter deluges. Wine cellars doubled as water repositories once the vintage ran out. Monks sighed, relabeled barrels, and comforted themselves with theological loopholes. Underground streams were tapped by miners who then collapsed the tunnels behind them to stop enemy infiltration, creating a potable labyrinth no invader could map. And if all else failed, they boiled nettle tea. Tasted like damp weeds because it was damp weeds, but it kept kidneys functioning. None of this mattered without ration discipline. Medieval councils produced quota tables with the joyless precision of a tax auditor. Bakers stretched flour with pea meal and ground acorns. Brewers reduced barley malt ratios, culminating in a beverage so weak soldiers joked it gave sobriety hangovers. Weavers repurposed loom weights as portion stones. 1 weight, 1 meal, no exceptions. Break the rules and you were exiled outside the gate, effectively a coupon for immediate enemy hospitality. Unsurprisingly, compliance soared. Yet towns didn't just hunker, they hustled. Nighttime sorties slipped through sally ports to raid nearby granaries or drive herds inward. Picture 50 hungry citizens sneaking past siege lines to kidnap sheep, like a reverse barbecue theft. Chroniclers at the 1303 siege of Gerona describe defenders sending out a fake funeral procession. Coffins stuffed not with corpses, but with garlic and cheese. Guards wept at the touching display of piety. The coffin bearers tiptoed back later, lighter of burden, heavier of smell. Smuggling turned into high art. Merchants disguised as beggars crawled drain pipes carrying dried figs in oilcloth bladders. Fishermen sailed under cover of fog, anchors loaded with pickled herring barrels that doubled as flotation devices. If spotted, they'd toss the barrels, shout "flotsam," and hope maritime salvage law baffled the besiegers long enough to escape. Sometimes even the attackers joined in. Bored soldiers accepted bribes to leak grain back in at night, effectively selling the defenders their own blockade supplies. Medieval warfare could be less us versus them, and more every man for himself, payable in beer. Inside, the psychology of plenty mattered as much as calories. Town poets composed triumphant verses about overflowing larders, read aloud at church steps to drown the rumble of empty stomachs. Bakers staged lunchtime parades, wagon wheels of bread stacked 7 high rolling past applauding crowds, even if half the loaves were hollowed and filled with straw. It was culinary theater. Convince citizens they were winning, and they'd fight like they were. Still, desperation brewed bizarre recipes. The 1188 siege of Kerak saw knights eating boiled leather from shield rims. They joked it was cowskin stew with iron croutons. During the 1422 siege of Meaux, cooks combined sawdust, onion skins, and grated horsebone into a passable porridge. The chronicler adds, deadpan, it wanted only salt. Reading between the lines, salt was gone, but sarcasm happily survived. Relief often arrived not by sword, but by economics. A siege cost obscene sums. Feeding an army outside the walls frequently bankrupted the aggressor faster than hunger thinned the defenders. Cities counted on that math, sometimes flaunting resilience to accelerate negotiations. Calais famously paraded well-fed children along battlements in 1346, prompting English commanders to mutter accounting curses. 3 months later, they accepted a surrender that let citizens evacuate with their personal goods, meaning all that hoarded food marched right out past soldiers now gnawing stale biscuits. Irony loves logistics. Behind the bravado lurked unglamorous heroes. Millers, coopers, tanners, and, yes, accountants. Rotating guard details kept flour fully aerated so it didn't cake. Barrel makers patched leaks faster than a bureaucrat could draft a requisition. Soap boilers rendered animal fat into hygiene. Crucial, because disease devoured sieges from the inside. One Florentine physician recorded that keeping latrines properly trenched saved more lives than 100 archers. Sanitation seldom features in epic poems, but it made epics possible. Then there was sheer medieval audacity. During the 1204 siege of Rouen, townsfolk catapulted beehives into the French camp, not to kill, but to distract, while smugglers ferried grain across the Seine in coracle boats. Bees did what bees do. By the time screams subsided, warehouses were mysteriously lighter. Of course, the defenders lost the city months later, but they gained a legend about bread delivered under buzzing escort. Children, too, found roles beyond being silent dinner guests. They gathered edible weeds from inner courtyards, unraveled old clothing for fire tinder, and acted as pocket-sized messengers crawling through drainage culverts no adult could fit. One boy in famine-struck Visby allegedly squeezed out nightly to steal the besiegers' signal flags, forcing commanders to recalculate tactics each dawn. Hard to starve when morale is boosted by pranks. Meanwhile, religious institutions became de facto welfare offices. Monasteries rationed communion wine by the thimble, but they opened hospices where the poorest received watered-down pottage. In exchange, they copied siege experiences into chronicles, turning starvation into scholarship. And because paperwork loves hierarchy, bishops sometimes granted indulgences for defensive fasting, absolving citizens whose meal portions dipped below canonical gluttony thresholds, proof that even heaven ran on supply chain metrics. What about the unlucky, who still ran out? They got creative, or macabre. The skeleton-thin defenders of Weinsberg in 1140 negotiated a peculiar surrender. Women could leave carrying whatever they could bear on their shoulders. Besiegers expected jewelry. Instead, wives hoisted their husbands. Food was gone, but loopholes still fed hope. The event birthed the proverb, "Loyalty of Weinsberg women," which politely ignores the subtext. Everyone left because pantry shelves were already bare. Throughout, music echoed. Minstrels reworded popular ballads into culinary taunts. Greensleeves became green peas, an ode to legumes holding the line. Drumbeats set marching pace for ration queues, because rhythm makes waiting feel shorter. Psychologists today would call it morale management. Medievals just called it Tuesday. When relief finally rode over the horizon, whether through diplomacy, disease in the besiegers' camp, or a merciful winter storm, towns flung open gates not with triumphant banquets, but with quiet audits. Granaries were unsealed, tally sticks compared against consumption ledgers. Amid celebration, clerks counted remaining sacks with the zeal of dragons guarding gold. The city had lived, but ledger blanks decided how quickly it would recover. Medieval resilience wasn't just grit, it was double-entry bookkeeping. And so the answer to how did they avoid starving is annoyingly practical. Massive planning, obsessive storage, ruthless rationing, opportunistic smuggling, psychological theater, and a sense of communal sarcasm that seasoned every thin stew. They did it because they had to, because no stone wall was thick enough to shield against an empty belly. Next time your pantry looks sparse, remember the people who planted lettuce on rooftops while arrows rained down and still found energy to catapult bees. You'll never look at canned beans or your neighbor's decorative sausage chains the same way again.